Most of us are familiar with the famous nursery rhyme that Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall and Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. Now all the king's horses and all the king's men could not put Humpty Dumpty back together again. That is a very insightful rhyme. Mr. Dumpty's world was shattered. It was broken into pieces, and he needed it to be fixed. What's interesting about the rhyme is where Mr. Dumpty went for help. He went to the big house. He came to Washington, D.C. because all the king's horses and all the king's men got involved. And they passed the Fix Mr. Dumpty law. They wanted to rectify this brokenness of his world. They funded it so that there would be the economic resources to implement the law to repair the damage. The tragedy of the nursery rhyme is that not only was Mr. Dumpty's existence shattered, but the most powerful system in the country was not able to repair him. So not only was there the disaster of Mr. Dumpty, but there was the disaster of all the king's horses and all the king's men. That the systems, the government, the White House, the Congress, the courthouse, and all of the other factors were not able to fix his dilemma. I'm sure you would agree that Mr. Dumpty's situation isn't too far off from our own, that we're now dealing with a shattered culture. Our divisions, racially, culturally, class, gender, social conflict is astronomical, and there seems to be no ability to resolve it, even by the most powerful people in our nation. They gather, they meet, they plan, but the unraveling just continues, and like Mr. Dumpty, things still are shattered. Every day we pick up the newspaper or listen to the news, we're hearing about more pain, more problems, more violence, more division, and more chaos. In the middle of all this, we've been subject to a virus, an invisible problem medically that has added and to some degree facilitated so much of the angst that is engulfing us today. But I would like to suggest to you that there is another virus that is the key to understanding the cause and the solution to Mr. Dumpty's problem, which is our problem of a broken world with broken people, living broken lives in a broken environment. There is a spiritual problem. And until the spiritual problem is addressed, all the other problems will continue in disarray. In 2 Chronicles 15, it talks about there being no peace in the land. It says there was no peace to the individual. It says there was no peace when he went home to his family. It says there was conflict in the cities. Then it went on to say there was conflict nation to nation. Sounds familiar? There was shattered brokenness everywhere. But then verse 6 makes a very interesting statement. It says, "For God troubled them with every kind of distress." I would have thought, with all of the dilemma that is spoken of there and that we're experiencing here, that it would have factored other things in, but it doesn't. It says, "For God troubled them with every kind of distress." Now, if God is your problem, then a politician isn't your solution. If God is your problem, a conflict is not your solution. If God is your problem, you've got to address that. Because if you don't address that, you've not addressed the cause and effect relationship. And we're told in verse 3 of 2 Chronicles 15 why there was the distress that was allowed by God. It says there was no true God. That is, the true God had been looped out. His name was being used, but his person, principles, and policies were being ignored. It says there was no teaching priest. The spiritual leadership had failed. And because the spiritual leadership had failed, it created a vacuum in the society that brought an evil virus into the lives of people and into the social structures of society. And then it says there was no law. In other words, people made up their own rules. They made up no law, their law. They borrowed other people's law because there was no divine standard to which everybody appealed. And so there was chaos. We have an atmospheric problem in our nation. And until this virus, spiritual virus, is addressed, this passive allowance of God to show us that when he is removed or marginalized in a life, a family, in a spiritual environment, or even in a nation, the consequences can be disastrous. So no matter what happens in this house or the White House or any other house, until we get the church house fixed so that we are bringing back the spiritual, none of the others can have a long-term solution. And we will be dealing with symptoms, not the cause. So what do? How do we begin to address the crisis that we face? Well, first of all, as individuals, you must make the personal decision that you are going to align yourself up properly. You can't control what everybody else does, but you can say a lot about what you do. You take the simple principle that Jesus told us to do unto others as we would have them do unto us. If you thought about with what you say and what you do, if that was done to you, would you appreciate it? And that should affect how you relate to your neighbor. God tells us to love God, but to love our neighbor. That is to seek their best well-being. If that was instituted individually, we would see a different atmosphere if you get enough people doing it. If enough people demonstrated acts of kindness, where every day they did a good work, a kind act, it would change the atmosphere. And then the family. The family is the place where values are to be transferred for righteousness and justice. God told Abraham, raise your children in righteousness and justice, a moral standard before me and equity with other people. When you put those two together, you address racial challenges and cultural challenges and class challenges because you are combining the twin towers of God. Psalm 89:14 says, from God comes righteousness and justice. The two must walk side by side as twins. And that's supposed to be transferred by families. Whoever owns the family owns the future. The saga of a nation is the saga of its families written large. And when God's principles are instilled from parents to children, if you want to destroy a society, destroy its families. And society has no hope for the future. And then there are the churches. The churches should be the conscience for the culture. It should not back away from bringing to the society God's point of view on every subject. You see, God has spoken and he has not stuttered. There are two answers to every question, God's answer and everybody else's. And everybody else is wrong. It is the job of the church to speak God's truth and not to dumb it down for cultural acceptance. Do it with kindness, do it with love, but do it with clarity so that they know, that all know what God has to say from your house to this house. God does not skip the church house to fix the White House. He expects all houses to be subject to him. The church should be the emulsifier. An emulsifier takes things that can't connect and connects them. The Democrats don't connect with the Republicans. Blacks don't connect rightly with whites and vice versa. Poor with rich, male with female. There needs to be an emulsification that grabs the sides because they're not ultimately committed to either, because they have a higher allegiance, but they bring God's truth to all sides. That is the role of the church in society. And then the culture. You know, in the Olympics, when America competes, when we win a gold medal and the gold medalist stands there, they do not ask him or her, what is your favorite song? They play the national anthem of the nation. Why? Because as talented as that athlete is, she belongs to something bigger, to the nation. What we must develop in our country, we say it in the Pledge of Allegiance, don't we? One nation under God. If we would become one nation, not using God's name, but respecting his person, adopting his principles, and instilling his policies. That's what it means to be underneath God, to be in alignment with God. When you bring God's name without being in alignment with him, you're just having a private conversation with yourself. So the challenge for America is a spiritual return that manifests itself in personal responsibility and loving one's neighbor, in rebuilding the family, in the church becoming a unified expression of the worldview of God being instituted in every community throughout the land without compromise or apology, and the culture reframing itself to be one nation under God. There was a submarine that was slammed, an S-4 submarine off of Cape Cod. It began to sink rapidly. 40 of the sailors rushed into a compartment, the last compartment that had air. And they sent out a code that simply asked, is there any hope? Because they were sinking so fast. America, we are that submarine. And we are sinking very fast. And the question that we all should be asking is there any hope? And that's why I want to leave you with Jeremiah 29:11 through 14. I have a plan for you, saith the Lord, a plan for your well-being and not your calamity, to give you a future and a hope. He says, if you'll return to me, seek me, and find me, I will let you find me when you search for me with all your heart. And then he says in verse 14, and I'll restore your fortune. This can become a great nation again. But that's because we've aligned ourselves with a great God. One day, the whole world will be brought into alignment at the return of Jesus Christ. In the meantime, we are to situate ourselves as what I call previews of coming attractions. Those are always the hot clips of the upcoming show. Fight scene, love scene, chase scene. It's designed to make you see the whole show or want to see the whole show. But one day there's a big show coming to town. Jesus is the superstar. The Holy Spirit is going to direct it, and God is going to be over it because it will be a worldwide production. Right now, we need some previews of coming attractions. Hot clips of the upcoming show, because we've instilled God's value system in the culture. When we decide to do that, because we have accepted Christ and decided to follow Christ as his full-time disciples, not as part-time saints. When we have biblical influence of salt and light in the culture. It won't change everything, but it can change enough so that we can see Humpty Dumpty put back together again. Let's do our part, if Christ be not come, to salvage and reverse the direction of our country. Remember, this is a God issue. God is shaking things up to get our undivided attention. Will we wake up, or will we watch the submarine sink? The answer is in our hands.